The purpose underlying this series of lectures is the effort to reconcile ideas and terms and practices which, for the most part, have divided human beings, not only in relationship to each other, but really to the various parts of themselves. Man is essentially a rather complex creature, and it is difficult to say that he is really consistent in his own thought and in his own reaction to the circumstances of living. His inconsistency is no doubt responsible for a considerable part of his trouble in life, but he seldom, if ever, attempts to reconcile the inconsistencies of his own concepts. We are all habit creatures, and we are all heavily influenced by prevailing attitudes and by prevailing word usages. Often we are divided more by words than by the principles behind words. And it has been said that if we could have a common language, and that if all persons understood words in the same way, we probably would have very few differences in life. But as each person uses words according to his own overtones, concepts, they are continuously separating us from each other and breaking up the continuity of our own thinking. Words also can confuse us, can cause us not to notice the mistakes that we make in our own policies. These words, then, become the bases upon which powerful psychological overtones develop and become exceedingly troublesome. Now, I don't know a nicer pair of words to worry about than materialism and idealism. These two terms sort of divide mankind. Each person belonging to an allegiance to one of these words is proud of his allegiance. The materialist is proud of being a materialist. For him, materialism has only a simple meaning: common sense. To him, there are two kinds of persons: materialists and foolish people. Now, the idealist, of course, is more liberal in his thinking. For him, there are idealists and fools. And beyond going into a very superficial addiction, it is not common to find that either group is too well in a position to justify its own attitude toward the ideas which underlie words. It is very easy to be in a classification, but to know why you're in it is more difficult. And to act as though you were in it is still more difficult. So many persons have allegiances only to words, and they fight, struggle, and die for those words. And they do not like other people who use different kinds of words, or even their own pet words in a different way, which can happen. So we'll begin with this term, materialism, which to the kindlier, more visionary kinds of folks is a sort of an unpleasant word, to say the least. What does it really mean? Perhaps the best answer lies in the concept that materialism believes that the universe is fully explained by the action and interaction of energy and matter. The materialist is convinced that there is no need for what we might term a supernatural order of things. There is no need for a theological dispensation. Some persons, however, of highly scientific mind, with a profound knowledge of the relations between energy and matter, are not materialists. And others who know nothing about the interaction of energy and matter are staunch materialists. The word covers, philosophically speaking, about everything from atomism to modern humanism. And it has within it such an interplay of factors and values that the more we analyze it, the more we realize that everyone is just a little bit of a materialist, whether he knows it or not. We know, for example, that there are certain factors in life which simply decline to change no matter what we think about them. Mark Twain pointed out that the weather was a good example of that. Everyone talks about it and no one does anything about it. That we are surrounded by facts, and to the degree that we commonly accept these facts, we get along rather well together. We accept the change of the seasons. We accept day and night. We may have a psychological resentment against the inevitabilities of nature around us, but we resign ourselves to them at an early age. Also, we are materialists to the degree that we have to admit the reality of the world around us as a great theater of factual things. There's no use to deny either the products of physical science, which we all enjoy, or the laws by which these products came into existence, or through the use of these laws and research, man has advanced his securities in a great many ways. A table is factual. We can't do very much about it. The monthly bills are on the factual side also. We might drop in a word about taxes. These things are factual. Not only do we know that they exist, but we know that many of these unpleasant inevitables are necessary for the continuity of life as we know living. That to disturb this pattern too deeply would be to disturb most of the values upon which we depend for our daily existence. Man therefore lives bodily, physically, in a bodily and physical world under its rules, and required by circumstances to accept a group of facts and to acknowledge their essential substantialness. We also recognize that out of our interrelations and interactions, there have come into being a group of sciences, arts, ethical codes, concepts, philosophies, industries, and systems, which are essentially physical. They would mean nothing to us if we were in another kind of a universe, but we are in this kind. They would be very meaningless to us after we depart from this world. But while we are here, we depend upon them, as we depend upon our automobile, as we depend upon all of the elements of communication and transportation which we daily use. The rapid development of these commodities has been due to emphasis. And one of the meanings of the word materialism is that it is a philosophy based on the concept that the greatest good is whatever most rapidly advances the safety, security, and progress of man. Now, of course, your idealist will balk at the problem of what advances the state of man. But the individual who finds the streetcar service inadequate, of course, that would not be appreciated so much in local conditions, where it is not inadequate, it is non-existent. But it does cause us to fume and to say, I wish they would run more often. I wish we had better administration of this, better executive forethought in that. So therefore, we are dependent to a great deal, for a great deal of our living, upon the smooth running of a tremendous machine which we have brought into existence. Whenever it gets out of kilter, we are inconvenienced. If the trouble gets too desperate, we are endangered. And the tremendous system of sewers, of aqueducts, of reservoirs, water systems, all of these things become necessary to our survival. Now, materialism points at these achievements and asks us if we want to go back to a time when men believed very strongly in many supernatural things, but were unable to take care of the sewerage, where it was true that we had a kind of idealism, but 500 years of the bubonic plague. So the materialist takes the attitude that there is a kind of religion, a kind of ethics, a kind of interior justification by which a human being dedicated to the physical improvement of his neighbor has a kind of dedication, a kind of faith, a reason for existence, a reason that enables him to go out and do a good day's work, if the unions will let him. A certain pride in achievement that might have been stronger a little while back than it is now, but still theoretically. It gives the person the idea that he has a sufficient, comprehensive way of life in living through the years, contributing in some way to the efficiency, to the smooth structure, and to the convenience and safety of his fellow creatures. Now, the materialist may take the attitude that this is enough. This is a complete life purpose, that it is a good purpose, that he does not need to apologize for it, and that he needs no other religion than this kind of dedication to preserving and advancing the institutions of society. This person, so dedicated, may go further. He may fight in a concrete way for abstract principles. He may believe in equality. He may believe that there should no longer be captive peoples. He may believe in the tremendous importance of world peace. He may believe in the inalienable rights of man to the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. He may therefore be a patriot. He may go out and die on a battlefield for the institutions which he regards as essential. And I have talked to materialists, so-called, on this subject, and found them very dedicated, and in their own way entirely honorable. But they do not feel the need for a universe bigger than today and its problems. They do not feel that there is any requirement for a philosophy of life more involved or more abstract than that which presses forward the great concepts of universal education, scientific achievement, and world peace. These are enough. and they want to leave a somewhat better world enriched by these factors to those who come after them. Now this can make, and does make, for a great many persons, a complete picture. It is all that is necessary. Everything beyond this is a headache. And the so-called materialist also has one very strong argument in his side of the picture. Namely, that most materialists that are basic in their thinking are agreed upon certain principles, whereas most idealists are not agreed upon the principles which they believe. The materialist sees a job at hand, rolls up his sleeves, and goes to work at it. But he claims that the other type of person, who has more abstract ideas, lives in greater confusion, greater interior division, greater sectarian separation, and that he is not as inclined to roll up his sleeves and get to work on the present job. That in some way materialism, therefore, becomes a synonym for being practical, for doing something, and doing it now. And that this life of action is more vital to progress than the life of contemplation. Now, there are other sides to this, but this is his side. And he is inclined to be somewhat critical of abstract idealism on the grounds that it does not have ready solutions for immediate needs, that it goes too far into hopes and theories, whereas the advancement of the sciences is a daily conquest of the enemies of mankind or the limitations of mankind on one level or another. So to him, materialism is factualness. It is immediate action. It is a present use of knowledge. It is the acceptance of the challenge of man's daily need. It is the fight against cancer. It is the fight against tuberculosis. It is the fight against the tropical ailments which have burdened other parts of the world. It is the fight against illiteracy, racial intolerances, class segregations, the fight against ignorance and superstition. These are the great struggles which he feels he is advancing by his position. If he is a sincere person, he is building upon the importance of accepting life as a continual challenge to achieve victory over things not yet conquered or made available for the use of mankind. Now let's turn to the other side of our problem and see what our idealist is. Our idealist is not another kind of creature. He has no different appearance, nor are his basic habits essentially different. When he is tired, he must sleep just as the materialist does. When he is unhappy, he may moan just as the materialist does. But his basic concept is upon a different kind of value. To him, the world as a physical structure cannot supply him with a satisfactory pattern for personal life. He cannot and will not accept the inevitability of progress being only material or physical. He has a number of very good points in his favor. He says, for example, for materialism to be an actual success, to be the thing we think it is, we must first of all, or ultimately, overcome the great enemy of all materialistic progress, and that is death. Death is the mysterious frustrator. Death is the departure of the individual from the material state of existence. To the materialist, this departure is final, and his own part in the world in which he exists ceases with his own death. To the idealist, any pattern of advancement which is circled only by death frustrates the continuity of purposed existence. The materialist is supplying a group of commodities for those who come after him. But those who come after him will also perish, regardless of him. They may last a little longer. They may live a little more comfortably, but they are surrounded by the same inevitable ends. They, in turn, regardless of their contributions, must likewise perish. So that we are advancing orders of life, all of which, according to materialism, are bounded by death. Therefore, nothing is actually meaningful from a material standpoint. Supposing we build a better world so that we will more regret to leave it, this will make death only more regrettable. Today, many people feel that they have lived long enough and are more or less content when their time comes. If it was a utopia, they probably would die less contented than they do now. Idealism also points out that man has never yet been able to devise any structure which is essentially self-operating. Man has never been able to make a machine which did not somewhere in its structure require a mind to direct it. Either the mind must create the machine, must keep it in repair, or must operate it. Now we can create batteries of machines. We can create 1,000 machines, perhaps so geared together that one man can run them all. But somewhere in the midst of this stupendous aggregate of mechanistic achievements, there must be one puny little human mind somewhere in the pattern. That in this universe, we can have the unfolding of a great mechanistic system without this unfolding arising from some cause superior to itself, seems to the idealist to be an utterly impractical conclusion. That this tremendous structure, with its almost infallible precisions, with its immutable laws and principles, and revealing through all of its interrelationships an extraordinary, almost incredible coordination, that all of this can exist and continue to exist without a mind and without a sovereign purpose beyond itself, appears to be unbelievable. Even the materialist thinker of today would scarcely devote a lifetime to the creation of a device or to the advancement of a field of learning did he not have some purpose in his mind. He wishes to achieve some end or other. Perhaps he seeks for fame. Perhaps he hopes for wealth from his ingenuity. Or perhaps he is a simple humanitarian and hopes that his discovery, his invention, or his contribution will be of service to others. But he must have a motive. He must have some motive for existence, or life becomes intolerable. These factors arise, therefore, from purpose. The materialist has a purpose. Can he then deny that matter has a purpose? Can he deny that things come together in patterns because there is a pattern? Can he assume that every symmetrical snowflake is a magnificent accident? If it is a magnificent accident, then why do so many of these accidents become absolutely essential to the advancement of science? Because science depends upon the regularity of phenomena. It depends upon the certainty of certain expectancies. And science would enter chaos immediately if any of its immutables suddenly became mutable. Yet it proceeds with a full confidence that certain laws and patterns will continue, that things will produce according to their kinds, and therefore that we live in a universe of law and order. Law and order seem to imply lawmakers and orderers of things. Consequently, the idealist, looking at the same universe as the materialist, and looking also at the materialist, perceives the materialist himself to be a person with an attitude. If the materialist has an attitude, has a conviction, has the willingness to defend his position and the rationalization to sustain his own argument, are we to assume that these faculties which he possesses are absent everywhere else in space? That mind can exist only in one type of creature? That the rest of the universe is mindless, unreasonable, irrational, purposeless, meaningless? The idealist says that he simply cannot accept this. He cannot adjust himself to the concept that he is a lonely thinker in a world that cannot think. That he is cast away with a mind on a little island in space in which there is no other mind. He does not accept the humanistic point that he is a Robinson Crusoe, who is lord of all he surveys. He cannot take the pragmatic position that the universe is simply a vast mass of putty that can be molded by man and man alone, because man alone has mind. And because he has mind, he is the inevitable master of matter. These thoughts are stimulating, and the more we think about them, the more we are inclined to feel that in certain of his conclusions, the idealist has a valid position. He has a valid position because he is moving from the only source that he can know, and that is himself. The idealist is acknowledging more of himself than the materialist acknowledges. The idealist acknowledges that his entire way of life arises from within himself, and therefore that there is a directive, and that this directive determines the conduct of his visible or material part. The materialist is doing the same thing, using the same directive, manifesting the same faculties, but denying the obvious analogy that these faculties, functioning in himself, is denying in the universe. This has led many scientific thinkers, as they continue to contemplate the mystery of the world, to reverse their attitudes. And this kind of reversal is occurring today. And it is not at all impossible that in the future, what we call material science will be the great patron and the great defender of idealism. Because of all forms of learning, science actually has the closest participation in the fact of universal intelligence. They just have not as yet come around the little corner that has divided them from seeing into this strange wall of matter, or around the end of it. Idealism is pragmatically or categorically defined as the belief that what we call matter is ensouled, directed, dominated by intellect, reason, or a reasonable kind of life, which the religionists call spirit. All idealists do not believe that the universe is spiritual. There are many schools of idealism which affirm the mind to be the root of ideal, and that mind creates within itself those directives by which all material things are altered into conformity with conviction, and that therefore evolution, as far as man participates in it through his own action, is the gradual transformation of conditions into a visioned or projected ideal state which arises within man's own interior imagination. Idealism, furthermore, ponders the grave question as to whether that part of man which is invisible, the mind, or to the religious idealist, the soul, or the spirit, whether we have any assurance that this invisible part is subject entirely and completely to the laws of visible matter. Many idealists affirm that the mind is a kind of matter, but more subtle than the rest, and that this kind of matter is a living kind of substance, having dominion over a less living or less highly evolved kind of substance, which we call matter. The great problem in idealism, then, is the glorification of conviction, and that life moves for its facts upon certain internal projections of man, and that these internal projections then become the impulses or the archetypes leading gradually to physical expression through arts and sciences. To the idealist, then, science is a means arising out of man's quest for method. Method being the most simple and appropriate manner by which that which is necessary can be accomplished. Method, therefore, is the technical way of doing those things which we regard as needed or important or vital. Instead, therefore, of science being the final custodian of knowledge, or the final ruler of the world of knowledge, it is actually merely a technique by which man builds an adequate architectural foundation under his own dreams. He lives for his dreams. Science helps them to come true. But without his dreams, science would be meaningless, because he would have no incentives, no motives, no pressures of conviction which would impel him to achieve anything. Thus, idealism is not primarily a study of a different kind of world. It is a grave question as to whether or not the world itself is not composed of two interrelating factors, each one indispensable to the combination which we call objective existence. Man is a compound of an inner nature by which his various drives are supplied, and an outer nature by which he is bound to a kind of world in which certain of these stress and striving factors gain expression. Thus, the idealist means merely the ideal part of man. The materialist means primarily the material part of man. These two parts within the compound of man himself must be reconciled. The life in the body and the body itself must be brought to friendliness. The life must use the body to manifest any of its purposes, whether they be noble or ignoble. The body must be sustained by the life, for if separated from the life, it falls to the earth and immediately begins to decompose. Consequently, there is a partnership in the relationship of life to matter. This partnership producing forms, and of these forms, man the most complex and extraordinary that we know. If we cannot reconcile materialism and idealism as conditions of our common thinking, then we are in poor position to reconcile ourselves with ourselves. And we must live in our daily lives ignoring some part of ourselves, or underprivileging some part of ourselves. And this happens. For most persons are inconsistent in this matter. The man whom we call a materialist is probably one who overemphasizes the significance of body and bodily situation, overemphasizes the importance of the comfort of the body, the success of the career, the honor of the personality. This type of individual, therefore, places the comfort, the convenience, and the security of the body first, and becomes so engrossed in this that he forgets to look for even a second choice. He gradually focuses all of his mental and psychical energies upon the body, failing to realize that it is by the use of these energies that he is maintaining the body, and that the body is not maintaining itself. A good materialism would require that the body should be a self-creating, self-sustaining, self-repairing machine. But it isn't. Everything relating to matter indicates dependence. And the individual who finds his body out of order must call upon the physician. It will not repair itself. Consequently, everywhere in nature there is evidence that there has to be repairing power, and that this power cannot arise simply from the machine itself. Certainly, the body can restore certain functions. Usually, however, only with the consent of the governing part, which must provide opportunity. Therefore, the individual says, I am too tired, my body is over-fatigued. If I give my body a chance, it will correct this condition itself through rest. But the person in the body must make this decision and must decide upon this rest and must enforce it upon the body, or the remedy is not found. The body will not do this automatically. If the body is outraged, it may declare war against the person, forcing the person to make certain concessions to its requirements. But these requirements are not of themselves sufficient, and this enforcement by the body nearly always requires decision on the part of the person also to make the situation effective in any reasonable manner. So we have now two beings within our breasts, as Goethe tells us. One to the heaven aspires, the other in the earth aspires. We have this division and discord. We have it in our ambitions. The division between the desire to be and the desire to have. We have it in a constant series of compromises with which we are confronted, and to which sometimes we too easily succumb. These compromises are choices between that which is a greater good for the person and that which is an immediate satisfaction to the body. Consequently, we have everywhere the evidence of the need of reconciling these opposites, to find out what their proper parts are, so that we may render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. Actually, this is the answer, but it must be approached with a certain amount of care and thought to convince persons involved in these problems of the proper position and attitude to take. Idealism should not and must not constantly depreciate material advancement, because to do so, it is denying better instruments for the use of the interior person. To say that it is a very passing thing of slight importance that we have defeated the bubonic plague is scarcely true. It has been a great step. For in 300 years, this plague in Europe took over 30 million lives. Now, to say that this is unimportant, or that lines of thought and learning which have assisted in defeating this ailment, at least in many parts of the world, that such achievement is comparatively negligible. It is not. It is important. The telephone is important. Transportation is important. Hygiene is important. Eugenics is important. These things have meaning. Their final meaning being that they provide certain guides, helps, and aids by means of which the relation of the person and his body, this relationship becomes better, healthier, that the achievements of the individual have a greater chance of maturing. Not so very long ago, there was a fortunate person who lived to be 50. Today, most individuals have a much greater life probability. A life probability of time in which to use the talents and abilities which they have earned so desperately through education and experience. that these are important contributions we cannot deny, nor should we fail to give credit where credit is due. Just as we should credit the body, by means of which we live in this world, and through the sensory perceptions of this body we contact this world. Now, philosophically speaking, we know that much of this contact is not reasonable, not final in its importance, but it is still a great part of our education, whereby we may ultimately learn to overcome or outgrow those very restrictions which body imposes, even as we need it to function with day by day. Now, on the material side of things, we have the problem of the relationship between science and philosophy. Philosophy today is essentially, in modern thinking, materialistic. By that we do not mean that it necessarily cooperates completely with the mechanistic theory, but it is inclined to view life humanistically. It is inclined to view that the primary purpose of man is the collective advancement of man, that the proper end of all human study is man. And it builds perhaps a little more egoism into the situation than the picture calls for. But philosophy also has a very important problem which it faces, and which it has not yet been able to adequately solve. Philosophy has as its purpose the creation of a reasonable creature. Now, a reasonable creature is one whose nature, by instinct, is reasonable. And by reasonable we now mean, as most philosophy implies, a reconciling kind of knowledge. Philosophy would impel the individual to avoid extremes, to search for moderate courses, and to attempt reconciliation of all things so opposing or so apparently different as to cause conflict in human life. Philosophy is therefore the reconciler. It must appear to provide the individual with insight and foresight. It must help him to weigh values and discard nothing that is useful or significant. The average person has never used philosophy as an instrument of discrimination. He has never been impelled by the essential principle of philosophy. That is, under the pressure of circumstance, always to seek the common ground. For this reason, we are creatures of extremes. We go back and forth like pendulums, swinging from one conviction to another. It is the purpose of true philosophy to dispose of the either-or classification of knowledge. This was the great Aristotelian mode, the mode that the either-or must ever be invoked. It is either so or not so. It is either good or bad. It is either white or black. It is either materialistic or idealistic. This either-or forces the individual to create a comparison. He must continuously ignore similarities in order to create contrasts. Comparison means the identification of something by destroying its common ground with other things so that it stands alone. Identification or the either-or approach, causes the thing to have meaning only to the degree that it is different. A good example, of course, and that's theology, which is the greatest either-or development in human society. It gained a special prominence and happiness during the medieval period when Aristotle was next to the patriarchs in universal veneration. The old saying, you are either in my faith or you are not. My old Methodist friend said there are two doxies in this world, orthodoxy and heterodoxy. Orthodoxy is my doxy, heterodoxy is your doxy. Now we have thought that way. And in religion, we have set up elaborate mechanisms to prove why our faith is different. Otherwise, they'd all get together and be one happy family, and that apparently is not what they want. What they really want is to remain separate, so that they can continue to be individual groups. And they are constantly hoping that more and more people will leave other people's groups and come into theirs. Such a person has increased in insight. And if someone leaves their group for some other group, he is a backslider. This is the either-or attitude carried into our way of life. And it has resulted in religion being a tremendously dividing force when it should not have been this. It was not so intended. But it emphasized these points of division. So when we are attempting to create this contrast, we must strip things of their similarities, and if necessary, invest them with dissimilarities. We must struggle constantly to find differences and build upon these differences codes of superiority for our own. We must always find that ours is a little better and a little different. To be brought up in this philosophy and to live by it over a period of 2/3 of a lifetime means that it creeps into other phases than theological. The either-or goes into our intellectual relations with other people. Their ideas and thoughts are either like ours or they are wrong. And we have created these tremendous dividers by which we have lost most of the common love of humanity, because we cannot love apparently that which is dissimilar with the same regard. That which is similar is our other self. That which is dissimilar is a stranger in our midst. Yet in our daily living, we live with a twofold self, which is essentially composed of dissimilars. There is scarcely a day in which the individual is not divided in himself. He is divided between convictions and conduct. He is divided between hopes and so-called practical considerations. He is divided between his dreams and the restrictions which his existence bestow upon him. He is ever ready to do good, but evil is nigh unto him. He believes in friendship, but he is afraid to be a friend. He believes that all men are honest except those he knows. He believes in doing good to everyone, but he wants the other person to do it first and prove that he means it. We are in continual conflict. We are in continual conflict between what we believe to be the substance of things hoped for and the dull thud of fact. Consequently, materialism represents always, or often at least, rationalization of something. And in the course of rationalizing most things, we rationalize the good in them out of existence. The moment we rationalize love, we have nothing. The moment we rationalize friendship, we destroy every value in it. For when we take out of things their own natural beauties and their natural vitalities, there's not much left. Yet we are continually rationalizing, and for the most part, in a negative way. Most rationalization drifts toward morbidity. It drifts toward a worse kind of world. It drifts toward fear, disillusionment. And then we come up with something much in the order of existentialism or the new beat generation. This is composed of individuals who have rationalized practically all of the good out of existence. They have rationalized it to the point where they acknowledge total defeat. And total defeat is nothing more or less than the complete frustration of the being in the body. If then we go on rationalizing and being incessantly and increasingly practical, we do not come to the ends we seek. For although we like to believe that science alone is contributing to our progress, we realize, in fact, that imagination has contributed more than all of science put together, because it is imagination in the scientist which has enabled him to break with science. And every new discovery in science is made by a scientist who broke with a previously established fact. He had to break with it. He had to break with everything he stood for in order to advance the thing he was standing for. Because if he does not do this, and he accepts the infallibility of exactitudes, science will go into crystallization and will not move again in any progressive way. Pasteur broke with science. Newton broke with science. Einstein broke with science. They were all these and hundreds of others were condemned by the very realistic schools to which they belonged. And then finally they were accepted and became the new orthodoxies. So everything depends upon a motion from within man that must break patterns in order to create new ones. And even scientific motion is over the discarded remains of fallen theories. There is nothing else man can walk over in the search for knowledge. If then what we call materialism is identified entirely with factualism, we must recognize that it doesn't exist as such. Because all materialistic progress is an individual trusting his weight on an idea and discarding a fact. If he trusted his weight correctly, he advanced. He advanced the total structure of knowledge. If he trusted his weight incorrectly, he was just one of those that didn't make it. But actually, he has to break with tradition in order to grow. And tradition has become more or less crystallized into the concept of one of the attributes of materialism, is this binding thing that ties the individual to patterns which cramp him, and against which the non-materialist struggles desperately for escape. Idealism and materialism live together in the same world. They build their philosophies upon the same evidence. They are looking at the same objects. They have personally the same kind of lives. They suffer the same ailments. They are burdened with the same economic and social responsibilities. They are the common sufferers from war, sickness, misery. Therefore, actually, there is only one field of evidence. And both these little plants have to grow in the same field, be fertilized with the same fertilizer, and also be lighted by the same sun and warmed by the same earth. There is no other. Consequently, we have to assume that the difference between idealism and materialism lies not in the universe, in which these two factors are so intimately and intricately interwoven that they are not separable. The two codes must arise in human attitude. It is the individual who makes these demarcations. Therefore, he creates both out of something that is a common substance. He creates by interpretation, or by the so-called rationalization of evidence. He uses the same evidence, but he comes to different conclusions. The only, again, answer that we can tell is that if things are the same, and here we go to one of the principles of Kepler, if things are always the same, never increasing or decreasing, and never changing their essential substance or nature, how then can difference arise among them? And Kepler said the only possible way this can occur is that circumstances, situations, and substances, ever the same and never varying from their own natures in any respect, are in a mutable relationship with each other. Therefore, what we call difference is relationship and not substance. Kepler therefore pointed out something that we know. There is no difference between the sun and the earth in winter and summer. The same earth, it's the same sun. No one goes out and turns the sun down. No one goes out and turns on the deep freeze in midwinter. Nothing is different except relationship. The relationship, the angle of the sun's ray to the earth changes. And as a result of that, it becomes midwinter in Boston and midsummer in Patagonia. 6 months later, the seasons are reversed, not because any substance is changed, but because relationship is changed. So we have these two kinds of people, probably best classically portrayed through the great pair, Plato and Aristotle. Dealing with the same universe, dealing with the same human beings, dealing with the same principles and energies, and arriving at different conclusions. Why? Because of relationship. And this relationship is well described in the classical story of the men exploring a city. Aristotle headed for the city gates. He went in with the Grecian equivalent of the notebook and pencil, probably a wax tablet and a stylus, and he began to make those voluminous notes for which he was duly famous. Everything in that city was of interest to him. He noted the people, the houses, the clothing, the vehicles, the streets. He noted every well and sewer and pump. And he also noted every place where teachers gathered in the schools, on the corners of the street, in the Lyceum and in the Forum. Nothing escaped him. And he wrote a wonderful story of the city. It missed nothing. Plato, on the other hand, went outside and climbed a hill nearby and did not immediately enter the city. And sitting down on the top of the hill, he looked down on the city. Aristotle saw the houses and Plato saw the city. They were the same places. But to Plato and Aristotle, these two became separate and different entities because of the way you looked at them. Also, the intricate working of the human mind proceeded differently. Now, Plato was not foolish enough to believe that sitting on the top of the hill, he could feel the heartthrob of that city. Nor is Aristotle foolish enough to believe that by wandering around the streets, he could gain a position in which he would not need some time to climb that hill. Both recognized the same objective. They both wanted to understand the city. Each was honest in his approach to it. Plato said, see first the city. Comprehend the entity, the total. Then go down into the streets and study the details. If you do it this way, you will never forget the total city. You will never be totally lost in the details. You will never fail to realize that these houses form larger patterns, that this city is oriented, that it has a shape and a kind of itself, and that streams of persons moving in and out of its gates cause it to be an organism, a strange institutional entity. And when you go down into the city, therefore, the houses and the streets and the roads suddenly become fixed into the map which you have before generally examined. Aristotle, on the other hand, having analyzed the city with its infinite minutiae, then climbed the mountain and tried to sense the total of the city. He felt that that was the wiser way, because he carried to the mountaintop all the details of the city which he could then fit together. Plato felt that the other way was better. And essentially this is the difference between your idealist and your materialist. Your materialist, represented by the Aristotelian viewpoint, goes into the city and becomes immersed in its problems and in the search for the solution of the problems. But a problem in a city relates to many things: crowding, to congestion, to poor sewerage, to lack of adequate water, and the danger that always lurks in that other city over the hill, which may invade you almost any moment. Therefore, you have large problems. Plato felt that Aristotle, in his glorification of detail, lost sight of the concept that underlies this, whereas the Platonic philosopher, having first placed in his mind the full concept of archetype, can then move down into the city and adjust all of its parts to the grand pattern which he has already visualized. Plato therefore held that the beginning of knowledge is the grand visualization of the universal plan. That man intuitively, interiorly, is capable of an apperception of the grand sublimity from which all things are suspended in their proper orders and relationships. That if we once become aware of the blazing archetype of law, of the magnificent integrity of things, if we assume this integrity, an integrity which our hearts and souls require, an integrity which no individual has ever been able to disprove, that we then move down into the problems of living in a better position not to be deceived by detail. We may see 1,000 apparent injustices in the marketplace, and we will take sides with these, and we will weep and moan over them, and they will become disproportionately important if we have no foundation in universals. The moment, however, we have foundation, our instinct is to seek for the justice in things. And Plato would differ from the materialist in the fact that the materialist of a constructive nature is seeking to create justice, really believing that this is his job, whereas the idealist does not have this curious audacity. Rather, he is seeking to reveal the justice that always exists. He feels his position is stronger, for it is better to live in a universe of good laws than to live in a jungle and be forced to create all the laws as you go along. Especially this is difficult when the other members of the jungle are not of a similar mind. It is more important to recognize that man has certain things to do, but that it is unreasonable to expect man to reform the universe. Or at least something has gone wrong, because he hasn't been able to reform even himself. Consequently, that the universe rests upon inevitables, and that it is the privilege of man to cooperate with these inevitables, to advance them, firmly believing that he is moving according to the total motion of his world. Now this essentially is an idealistic position because it expresses certain convictions, namely that there is a plan, that it is possible for man in varying degrees, according to his various natures, to apperceive this plan, to apprehend it, to know it, to be aware of it, if not to fully understand it. And it is therefore his right and his proper duty to align himself with this existing plan and cooperate for its unfoldment. He feels that it is a form of egotism to insist that he must create this plan. Because if he must create the plan, what was the state of things before he was created? What was the miserable dilemma of the world for the billions of years when man wasn't around to take care of it? What about innumerable other worlds which man cannot really know? Must everything rest dark and fallow until man gets around to it? At his present rate, there's going to be innumerable delays. It is far wiser in the thinking of this, in terms of practical utility, for man to give allegiance to purposes that are valid and which have an existence apart from himself, but of which he is an expression and embodiment. It is better for him to do this than to flounder in the uncertainty with which he is presently afflicted. For if all the responsibilities for the universe rest upon him, he is ill prepared for the responsibility. He cannot make decisions. He has not ability to make the kind of decisions which will maintain the equilibrium of the universe. He simply cannot do it. Therefore, he can ignore it. He can simply take the attitude that let the universal business take care of itself. I have certain powers by means of which I can attain a measure of security. I will use them and let the devil take the hindermost. But this again does not accomplish any essential purpose. For this attitude has resulted in the continuous exploitation of universal resources until man begins to wonder if he hasn't been rather wasteful of things he may ultimately need. His own wisdom is not great enough. If, however, he wishes to settle down to an analysis of his own possibilities, he can say rather simply that there are spheres of action in which his leadership is possible. There are other spheres of action in which the leadership of something superior to himself is necessary. He is wise who can distinguish these levels and live accordingly. The human being, as a rational creature, has the right to perform such action as he knows or believes to be good and necessary. He has a perfect right to build as good a world as he knows how to build. He has a perfect right to advance every useful art and science. But he has not as yet the skill to become a despot or a dictator over knowledge. He can use it, but he cannot totally control it. Nor can he determine the reservoirs of it, both in himself and in the total universe in which he exists. Man living upon two levels, therefore, can reconcile and can create a useful life. Generally speaking, your idealist has certain weaknesses also, which need to be cleared. Your dreamer is usually a person of increased sensitivity. The idealist is more easily hurt, more concerned, more subject to neurotic pressure. He is living a more sensitive kind of life. As a result of this sensitivity and the refinement of the levels of his action, he is subject to labors different from those of the objective person whose resources are immediately physically available to him. Therefore, the idealist is, for the most part, a merchant of overtones. He is continuously contributing to the hope and to the faith of men. And this is a valid contribution, because all men must move from faith and hope within themselves. And without this inner motion, their physical abilities lose most of their importance. On the negative side, however, your idealist has generally been regarded as lacking the resolution to attempt the physical changes which his sensitivity indicates to be necessary or proper. He is therefore inclined to run away from the physical impacts of life. He is inclined to be hurt too easily. And he is inclined to substitute his hopes for action. This has been one of the great complaints against philosophy, and has caused many people to think of the philosopher as an armchair intellectual who solves everything in words and nothing in fact. And many have been guilty of precisely that course of conduct. Actually, the life of idealism, if it goes along without creating cooperative bounds and bands between itself and objectivity, becomes too unworldly, leaving perhaps a wonderful heritage of beauty or of poetry or of music or of noble sentiments. Now, these are good, and they do help. But man, drifting into the emergencies of the present time, has been surrounded with kindly words and beautiful thoughts for ages, And yet the 20th century is the most bloody, destructive record in human history. So something is not quite right. This something that has not been right, has led to the term applied to the idealist of being an impotent intellectual. That he certainly has beautiful thoughts, and no one can deny them. But these thoughts never come true, or if they do, only after so vast a time of human misery, that it seems there is a sterility in such abstraction. This is due, definitely, to the either-or position, that the individual must be one or the other. The only answer lies in the union of the idealist and the materialist elements, and the common interchange of the values that both have. There is something very important for an idealist to learn about rolling up his sleeves and getting in and doing it, which he is inclined to let other people worry about instead of himself. There is also something about the materialist that needs to be warmed within itself, given a light, given an insight, by means of which it is impelled to dream of greater good than that of mere physical continuance. Physical science is becoming somewhat unattractive to us today. We worshipped it for a long time, but we suddenly see that mechanism is not as practical as vitalism as a basic theory. We see how skill, going along divorced from moral overtone, has come to a dangerous conclusion, namely that it is a free agent. The individual who believes that there is no law governing him except the law imposed by himself is liable to develop the Mussolini philosophy, in which it is better to live 5 years as a lion than 50 years as a lamb. And if there is no rule beyond man, the autocratic despotism of man has no limitation except his own genius to maintain it. By this process, dictatorship, as we find it now in the Iron Curtain countries, is perfectly legitimate as long as the individual can maintain it. And all he has to do is become more skillful, better equipped, and have a better secret police, and he can maintain it longer than the next man can. Scientific knowledge will help him to maintain the position of isolated supremacy for himself, and also supply him the means of preventing other people from attaining that condition, if necessary, by extermination. So this attitude is dangerous. Yet it must come from the basic assumption that man is absolutely free to do as he pleases, and that the only limitation upon him is his own skill. To have this is to finally create the most dangerous and terrible tyranny of all, the tyranny of man over man. Now, we watch these characters through history. Each one of them has also watched his predecessors in this profession. Every one of them has fallen. Each one has found that in nature there was something in the form of a vast plow that plowed through his every ambition and plowed him under with the rest. Yet he never learned, because he firmly believed that the plowing was merely an accident, and therefore might never happen again. And because there was no law regulating the game, he could or might win. Despotism is all built on the supremacy of the individual purpose over universal value. If this continues, we are all going to lose a great deal of scientific heart, among other things. We're going to lose the respect we have for learning, because this learning is going to lead us into the supreme blind alley, the idea that whatever we want to do, that we have the inalienable right to do if we can. Anything we can take, we have a right to take if we're strong enough to take it. And in the universe, it will be a vast race as to who is strong enough to take over the general management. We are moving in that type of direction, but we're moving less heartedly all the time. The pattern is falling to pieces in us and around us. We find that we cannot live with ourselves or anything else, and that our relations with other persons is becoming so hazardous that the so-called victory is not worth the danger. If we take the idealistic position, we do not lose the activity with which we can vitalize our conduct. But we study the laws of nature, we study the same mathematical principles, we work on the same formulas of fission that are now so popular in physics, but with one other thought, namely that all these intricate laws and processes and formulas bear witness to a tremendous purposefulness, that they are the ultimate and final proof that this universe is an actual, operating, ensouled body, an entirety moved by an entity within itself. Consequently, that man must come to terms with this entity, that he must come to terms with the collective. And whether he calls this collective God, or truth, or wisdom, or virtue, or the final good, is not important. Man has demonstrated through the ages that his survival depends upon his recognition of a sovereignty of good, and that without the recognition of this sovereignty, he is too dangerous to himself and other people. Up to very recently, the development of the concept of this sovereignty of value was arbitrary. Men affirmed it or denied it, or must struggle to achieve it through the complicated and often inconsistent logical formulas of religion. In other words, we could accept the words of the preacher, or we could accept it in 15 volumes by St. Thomas Aquinas. These rationalizations of theological value, or as in the case of Maimonides in his great work, The Guide for the Perplexed. But these things were rationalizations. Suddenly the door opened, and with the rise of the inductive method in the 17th century, all knowledge was placed upon an experiential level. Tradition, observation, experimentation were substituted for logic. The individual gained certain strength from the common knowledge of his entire human body or structure. This was tradition. He gained a certain immediate knowledge of the universe through experimentation, which was forever opening doors, ever revealing new ways of doing things and of using things. And then, by observation, he came to behold the wonders of it all. He suddenly opened his eyes into a universe in which all good things were immediately visible to him. Tradition gave him a great wealth out of the past. Observation gave him the opportunity to see now. Experimentation, to repeat formulas, to continually reproduce under laboratory conditions certain processes until he was convinced of their immutability as processes. To the materialist, this meant freedom from the need for God. And it was in much this way that Laplace stated it. To the idealist, this suddenly resulted in the emerging of the splendid image of the truer God. Suddenly God became invested in his own laws, his own principles, and the magnificence of his own obvious, demonstrable continuance. Both perceiving the same thing, the materialist and the idealist. One saw now the universe emerging as a machine, free from the superstitions of the past. The other saw the universe emerging as the final proof of the divine plan. This conflict has really nothing to do with what either one of them saw. What we call the modern school of humanism, we term materialism today, was a psychotic position, for the reason that it did not arise from the serenity of man's contemplation. What we know as materialism was a revulsion against theocracy. It was man seeking desperately to escape tyranny, the tyranny of the state, the tyranny of the church, and the tyranny of the mass. And these three tremendous forces caused him to cut loose as far as he could from everything that he had previously known and make a basic rebellion the secret of his new freedom. In a way, he was born by a sword, the sword with which he cut himself from the ages and separated his own way of life from all other living. And by the sword with which he made this change and cut himself loose, and by the sword by which he has since lived to defend his isolation, by that sword he may ultimately perish. For who lives by the sword shall perish by the sword. He did not stand up as one of the old Greeks, suddenly becoming aware of the beauty of the world. He came to it with a strange passion of vengeance, with the same powerful emotional pressure that caused Luther to tear the papal bull from the church door at Wittenberg, tear it up, and strike out with everything that was in his truly pious heart against the sale of papal indulgences. It was rebellion. It was the same rebellion that caused Puritanism, that caused this square-toed attitude toward everything, that took art and music out of faith and gave us the inevitable problem of the hard wooden pews and the unpainted church. These things were a struggle against something. They were an effort to free oneself from the stranglehold of a previous tyranny. Materialism, therefore, was a great reaction against something that was intolerable and which was pressing down upon the common good of mankind with tremendous force. Not intentionally, not knowingly, but by the gradual building up of an oligarchical system through the ages, which everyone either belonged to or knelt before. This rebellion caused man to want to cut loose all ties that bound him with every aspect of the past. And one of the things that he tried to cut loose from was the tie that bound him to God. He did not realize that the God that he needed was not the God fabricated by some earlier theology. He tried to remove God as a theological agent, and in so doing created a very bad spot for himself. Instead of cleansing, and re-evaluating, he did what revolution always does. He swept away everything, and then years later tried to put the pieces together. On the other hand, idealism is not really addicted to this peculiar fault. You realize that what we call modern materialism is perhaps 350 years old. Modern science, 300 years old. Idealism is 10,000 years old. It has never been placed in this strange position. It has always existed. It has been profaned. It has been distorted. It has been deformed. But the essential substance of it has never been changed. It has nothing to do with the institutions that failed it. It has simply gone on. Gone on because it belonged to an internal life of man that was unforgettable. A life of man which he insists upon desiring to preserve, and which he is fighting for today with everything that he has. So idealism is actually much more the philosophy of the relaxed person who is not on the defensive. Materialism is a defensive position, and most materialists are on the defensive continuously from the feeling that they are misunderstood and disbelieved, or are going to be disliked because of their honest conviction. Idealism has never been in this peculiarly defensive position. It perhaps has suffered more in recent years than ever before, but is still not essentially broken by any of these pressures. It goes on its way because it is what the individual feels when he is not trying to distort his own feelings or defend his own opinions. Man by nature and in substance has an idealistic pattern which is present in primitive man. Prehistoric man was an idealist, not a materialist. Though he knew nothing about the higher dimensions of space, he accepted them all. He did not for one moment become completely hypnotized by matter. And even when he was much less adjusted in it and struggling against it much more obviously than we are, he still held to a pattern of value. Psychologically, therefore, idealism is a natural psychic pattern in man. Materialism is not. Therefore, materialism does not get the support of the psyche to the same degree that idealism does. And your psychotherapist today is beginning to realize that the materialist is a sicker person who has more trouble getting well than the idealist, because the idealist has values. And while some psychologists like to think that these values are superstitious, still the same man finds that they contribute to the recovery of his patient, whereas unbelief contributes to the recovery of nothing. In analysis with children, in working with persons who have not been falsely educated out of their convictions, we find that even where there is no formal thinking on the subject, there is a natural belief in what we would term the idealistic position. The child naturally wishes to believe in a good world, a world of value, a world in which there are principles, and a world in which also there is a governing principle over principles. The idealist has perhaps a little clearer vision, therefore, of his own job. The main thing is to get him into action. He knows or feels that he is the servant of something bigger than himself. This is a good position to be in, for most men are happier as servants than they will ever be as masters. The fact that we are dedicated to some value beyond ourselves is the basis of true heroism, a valid, intelligent kind of dedication. But to move from the security of dedication into the turmoil of our daily problem requires a bridge of very practical thinking. Judgment, discrimination, discretion. These are the bridges which link idealism and materialism in action. The materialist needs to use discrimination, for by discrimination he will gradually broaden his own foundation and lift himself out of his own materialism. The idealist needs discrimination, for he must recognize there are situations in life that he must face, and that he must face with simple and direct action, and that there are things in the physical world that have to be handled here, and handled as accurately and speedily and conscientiously as possible. What then is the contribution that idealism makes to enlightened materialism? Perhaps the principal contribution that idealism has to make is that it gives a deeper and more pressing incentive. Idealism makes all jobs more significant. It causes the individual to escape from or extricate himself from the personal and completely self-centered pattern of projects with which he is concerned. The idealist has moral motivation of a deeper and more universal type, inasmuch as he also has a sense of resource, which the materialist does not have. Now, some will say this sense of resource is a superstition or a delusion. Long ago, well, not so awfully long ago, some holy relics were sent to this country, a beautiful jeweled casket, and persons with various difficulties, weaknesses, and defects all felt that by merely touching these relics, they would recover or have new values given to them. So the very triumphant tour of the relics took place, and thousands of persons testified to their wonderful benevolence. And then somebody chanced to look inside the box and it was empty. They'd forgotten to put in the relics. But everybody felt better whether there were any relics in the box or not. Now it is the same in man. Assuming, if you want to, the skeptical position that in this mystery there may be no relics in the box. Yet the psychologist tells us that the man who is sick gets well if he believes the relics are in the box, and he gets sicker if he doesn't. Now, what does this mean? Can that which is true cause a man to be sick? What is a relic in this case? Nothing but a symbol of a value. Something by which the individual's restatement of his belief and conviction is intensified. If this belief and conviction were essentially wrong, would the relic ever be able to effect a cure? By being present or absent. if the type of attitude that brings recovery from physical, emotional, mental, moral, spiritual infirmities, if idealism or the faith in things makes people well, and lack of faith does not make people well, are we in a position to say that this is totally a human psychological situation? If this situation was contrary to universal pattern of any kind, then the relic could not cause the individual to get well, nor the belief in it. And certainly if it wasn't there, he certainly wouldn't get well. The materialist will answer it and say yes. But this recovery is simply part of the proof of humanism, namely that every individual can be his own physician and needs no other. That's a tricky point. The answer again is, however, what is the trick? The trick is the introduction into the life of the individual of the sincere belief in the availability of a power greater than himself. Whether you accept this as arising from a materialistic auto-hypnotic force, or whether you regard it as an ethical justification for spiritual conviction, the chemistry of it, working in the body, says that that kind of a belief makes people healthier, and the opposite kind of a belief does not make them healthier. Socrates would have advanced this as proof that because belief makes men well, and unbelief does not make men well, that this is the final proof of the law of belief, and that any belief that makes the individual consistently better, consistently more useful, and consistently more serene and secure as a being, must be in conformity with some pattern. If the universe was truly an accident, and whatever you believed made no difference, then you would not have the sharp line of demarcation. You would have various types of attitudes, which at any moment might produce any inconsistent consequence you wish to imagine, but they do not. Certain codes of action, moved by certain convictions, have always been finally victorious. The converse type, that which is different or opposed to this kind of action, has never produced these results. Therefore, in nature, there has to be some pattern by means of which these results are attained. And idealism is built upon the premise that it is demonstrable that belief in all problems involving the better condition of individuals and collectives, that right belief is stronger than unbelief, and therefore being stronger must be more in accord with the sovereign purpose of the world. Otherwise it could not produce constructive effects. It is the duty of the idealist not to condemn or criticize the opposing group, but to try to take the opposition out of the situation by creating a comradeship in which the idealist strengthens the inner resolutions by means of which he hopes to use the instruments of knowledge, whereas the materialist supplies the improved instruments, and that both persons ultimately must be united into a common fraternity, For the house is barren unless a man lives in it, and a man is cold and forlorn without a house. These two are the parts of one unit. Idealism pointing the way and materialism supplying the means. And if these two work together in the life of the individual, he will be without the conflict that burdens him today. And if in the larger pattern of society these ends are reconciled, and we no longer attempt to divide them, but instinctively seek to enrich all of the needs of our lives by the good that others have accomplished, and bestowing all the good of our lives upon needs which others have revealed. If we can create this partnership and take the negative thinking out of our own contrasts with knowledge, we will be in a better position to use skillfully and to remember that the dream must be put into action, and that the action in turn must be sustained by a dream. Thus these two groups work together and are merely the natural twofold expression of one energy, and that this one energy has as its final end the common good of all that lives. When we see it that way, I think we can overcome the tendency to critically compare one group with the other.